Welcome to our webinar, using SaltStack to automate your infrastructure. We have been using SaltStack for a few years by now, and it's saving us a lot of time managing our servers. And we overcome many challenges, how to create formulas, and how to use it efficiently, how to maintain code. And here's Priyank, and he is our expert in SaltStack.
Hey everyone. Okay, so welcome again to the webinar. In this webinar, we will mainly be discussing about SaltStack as to what it does, how we are using it in our infrastructure, and what good it is, like what kind of things can people do using Salt. Now, most of the people in the industry might have heard about the term Ansible, right? Ansible, people say, is basically used for automating some of the redundant system administration tasks like installing things, managing some configuration files and things like that. You're doing some DevOps activities and all those things, right? So Salt is similar to Ansible, but Salt has more power and more capabilities to do multiple things. So that is what we are going to discuss in today's webinar. If you are a system administrator, or if you think you are running your own company and you think your infrastructure is scaling, then this webinar will help you understand how to tackle those problems and how to basically unify your infrastructure using the power of Salt. So let's first talk about what will be the session today. We will be talking about what SaltStack is. So it's a very introductory session. It's not for advanced or intermediate people who already know what Salt is, but mainly for the people who do not have an idea of what Salt does. Or if you think that, as I mentioned, that if you have a big company and you do not know how to unify your infrastructure, then this will be useful. Mainly, with the utility of Salt, we'll be discussing that what can be automated. Now, Salt is not an omniscient tool that can be seen everywhere and for everything. It is something that has a scope as like all the other tools, and this is the main scope that we'll be talking about. It is used, we'll be talking about how to use Salt for config management, for security operations, for installing or removing certain applications across different operating systems, and also regarding reactions based on specific events. So before we jump into the content of our SaltStack webinar, the question to ask is whether you need Salt or not. Because as I mentioned, you can complicate your infrastructure as much as you want, but the thing is that, is there really a need for it? So when you ask yourself that, do you need Salt, then you must be having similar answers, to the points that I have mentioned in this slide, that you do need Salt if your infrastructure has multiple redundant machines with similar configurations. Okay, even though Salt is capable to handle different configurations, but let's say that you have less than 10 virtual machines in your infrastructure, then is this really a good idea to set up Salt? Because Salt comes with its own overhead, right? You have to maintain a separate code base with the information about Salt and things like that. So that answer is really important. You need to have a large infrastructure with, let's say, 10 or 20 plus VMs. If you have less than 10 VMs, then rather than managing Salt yourself, you can hire someone like us who already have a Salt infrastructure and, incorporate your infrastructure with us, something like that, or not use Salt at all, because Salt comes with an overhead and it's not a good idea, generally speaking, to use it for less machines. Your infrastructure is constantly changing. Well, if you think that you need to track the changes of your infrastructure, if you think that, today you are installing MySQL and tomorrow in the same machine, you are installing Redis and other database related stuff, and you want to keep a historic track of things, then also Salt is good. And lastly, if you think that there must be a centralized location or server that controls all the remaining servers, whether you have 4 VMs or 5 VMs. If you think that you really need some core place from where you have to, you get the capability to control other VMs, then definitely SaltStack is for you. But if you are a small company, well, you should rather think about outsourcing your requirements of managing infrastructure or things like that. So um, that is that. And now let's jump towards the actual part of the actual meat of the presentation, where we'll talk about what Salt is. Now, people are familiar with the idea of Ansible, and when we talk to DevOps engineers or developers or general system administrators, they might have heard commonly the term Ansible and what it does. Well, we write playbooks the way how we write playbooks in Ansible. Similarly, we write something called a formula in Salt. They do share common similarities because the objective of Salt was same as Ansible when the project started. When the founder of SaltStack started writing the code for Salt, the objective was to do something for automation, right? But then eventually Salt got so much support in its open source community that it evolved to be much greater than a simple config management or automation tool. But what is Salt basically? Well, Salt is a piece of software just like other softwares, and it automates repeated system admin and DevOps related activities. It is useful for not just automation, but it is useful for a lot of people, a lot of classes or sections of people in IT. It can be useful for system admins, could be useful for DevOps, could be useful for security operations engineers, as well as software developers. This is the basic architecture of what Salt is. So now if you want a picture in mind, what does Salt do? The way how Salt works is that there is something called a machine which has Salt master installed on it, right? Let's say you have a Linux machine which has a Salt master installed on it. Using this Salt master, you connect to all the virtual machines across your infrastructure. I'm not talking about 5 or 10 virtual machines, or as a matter of fact, I'm not even talking about 10,000 virtual machines, because Salt has a capacity to scale to almost 1 million minions simultaneously. So it means that whether your machine on the other hand of your infrastructure, let's say you have a Windows machine which has Active Directory installed, then you have a MySQL server which has MySQL installed, then you have an application server which has Tomcat installed, right? And you want to put all these virtual machines together. You want to create a web inside your infrastructure where every node is accessible by a single parent node called Salt master, right? That is how Salt works, where the machines that the master connects to is called Salt minions, and the master itself is called the master. But one thing to keep in mind here is that master minion communication is possible, but minion to minion communication is not possible. That is how general architecture of Salt was created, because if minions start talking with each other, then it will create a lot of complexities. But rather, there is a single event bus that runs through master, and any event generated on the minion is communicated to master, and then master takes necessary actions or can do whatever it wants based on events generated on the minions. But yes, if you ask the question that can minion to minion communication be possible, then there are some hacks, but we will not be talking about that in this webinar. But yes, this is how generally the diagram of Salt architecture looks. And if you see, on the other hand, the best thing or the most beautiful thing about Salt is that it is agnostic to the operating system. Okay, when you do salt star disk.usage, you do not have to worry that what machine is at the other end of this command. This command returns the output from Windows as well as from FreeBSD, from Solaris as well as from OS X, which means that you do not have to worry. When you run a command on Salt, you do not have to worry that is that command specific to the operating system that you're trying to access, because that is the beauty of the Salt, that it abstracts the underlying code and it just gives you a handle. Similarly, if you, let's say you want to install something, then usually the command for that is package.installed. Okay, you do not have to worry whether you're asking for that installation on Windows or you're asking for that on Linux. Package.installed will tap into the necessary package manager of that operating system and give the command to install the package accordingly. So that is the beauty and the power of Salt. Okay, now that we are a little familiar with the idea of Salt's architecture, let's see a simple example. Okay, imagine that you have a virtual machine named vps4.itsecura.com, and that virtual machine, you need to run a command, but you cannot access that virtual machine directly. Instead, that machine is connected to the Salt master, and using Salt master, you want to run a specific command on, let's say, 1 or 100 virtual machines, right? And this is the command, how it goes, that you write on your Salt master, you type this command, you type salt space the target that you want to reach, right? Because every minion connected to the master has its own name. So you can target based on names, and something called pillars too, which is not something which is not the subject of discussion, but there are basically 100 different ways in which you can target the virtual machines that you want. And then you type module.function and the arguments after that. So let's say you want to run a particular command on vps4.itsecura.com, then you type salt space the name of the minion space cmd.run. Cmd.run will basically run any command on the target, right? And then you type touch space the file name. Okay, so this will create a new file.txt at the desired path on vps4.itsecura.com. Now, similar is the case. Let's say you want to not just create the file on one machine, but let's say you want to do it on 100 machines. Then you simply specify what the grouping of the target is, right? And run the command. And if you want to learn more about grouping and things, you'll have to dive deeper inside how Salt works. Since we are not going to talk, since we are touching only from the top, we'll not be talking about these things in detail. But this is generally how SaltStack works. You can communicate to different minions. And by minions, I mean thousands and thousands of minions without it consuming a lot of time. So it's a very fast, lightweight tool that you can use like infinitely in your infrastructure, even though it has its own limitations, but those limitations are hard to reach that easily. Okay, so now we are going to touch specific things or specific utilities with a simple example in the context of Salt. So just 1 second. Okay, so yes, now we'll mainly be talking about different things. Like when I say configuration management, what I mean is, let's say you have an Apache server and it has multiple virtual hosts inside it, right? If you want to manage that load balancer according to, like if you have, let's say you have 10 different load balancer with same configurations, and you have to make some change in all 10 different load balancers in one of the files inside it, will you go individually on every load balancer, do an SSH login, change that particular file and jump back to the next load balancer? I don't think that's an ideal way to do that, right? So that is when automating your configuration management comes in. So that's the case, that if you have 10 different load balancer and you want to set up something, you want to change something uniformly across them, then you can use Salt. So let's see this example, that how to manage a vhost file through Salt. As I mentioned, 10 load balancers and you want the same vhost file to be managed. Then inside a file called manage apache host.sls, because .sls is the extension using which Salt understands that basically Salt takes input as simple YAML, okay, with a touch of Jinja, right? So you need to tell it that inside the file you need to declare that this is what you're planning to do. If you are planning to manage a particular file, then we say file.managed, right? And we mentioned that, okay, this is the name of the file. Let's say I want to manage something called example domain.conf under etc http host.t, and the source of the file lies on my salt master, right? Because my salt master knows that what file am I planning to manage on the other hand, on the other end of the infrastructure. So let's say you put this file in place on your salt master, then on salt master all you need to do is run this command. Okay, you need to run salt target machines star state.apply manage Apache host. Now, saying again, manage Apache host is considered to be a singular state. Okay, this is called the state because we are trying to enforce a state on our infrastructure. We are trying to enforce, you know, we're trying to give our infrastructure a certain shape, and we say that our infrastructure should not change or should not move away from this state, right? So we call each file that we create inside the context of salt as a state, and then we apply that state using the command state.apply. So when this command is executed on 10 different Apache hosts, right, it will create a file called example domain.conf extracted from this file on our salt master, and it will make sure that the file is same across different load balancers. So the target is usually decided by you, okay, because you know that which machine is a load balancer and which machine is a MySQL instance, right? So that needs to be clear in your head that when you apply something, you need to apply it to a batch. And that simple that is, like just using this one command, you can enforce or you can create or basically update the file example domain.conf across different load balancers. So that is the power of Salt. And talking about just file management is just one part. Similarly, you can do package installations, or that we'll talk about in the next slide. But not just that, you can manage multiple files, do package installations, removals, and whatnot. Hundreds different system administration tasks using Salt. Right. So that's simple, as I mentioned. So now, since we talked about automating configuration management, we can now jump towards something about application setups, right? We talked about how to manage configurations of Apache. Similarly, you can manage configurations for Redis, or you can manage configurations for your my.cnf in MySQL or things like that. But when it comes to a particular application, it is not just managing one file, right? When you say that you want to automate MySQL on your machine, it is not just like managing my.cnf file. It is also about installing MySQL the correct way. If MySQL is already installed, then it's also about making sure that the configuration is up to date. It is also about managing the databases and things like that. So when multiple different states come together inside a collective state, we call that state to be a formula. Let's say there's a MySQL formula on the internet, or there is a Vim formula on the internet. So what the formula does is that, well, it's really abstract what a formula can do, but generally speaking, what a formula is responsible for is that it is responsible for installation of a certain application. And once it is installed, it is also responsible for managing the configuration related to that application automatically. Okay, so in this presentation, I would not be talking about MySQL formula because it seems to be a little complicated, right? But we'll be talking about a formula, a simple formula of VIM, which is Vim editor, right? Now we all know that Vim is a very popular editor, and most of our Linux machines use Vim as the common editor, right? but Vim does not come pre-installed, let's say. And let's say that you have a need where your team has 100 different CentOS 7 virtual machines, or let's say a mix of virtual machines, including CentOS and Ubuntu, and also FreeBSD, and you want to install Vim on all of them. But the important thing is that Vim RC, which controls the appearance of the Vim, should be uniform in all of them. So you have two jobs here. One is to install Vim uniformly on 100 different Linux operating systems, and to make sure that it appears identical. The screen of Vim appears uniformly on all the different operating systems. So ideally, in such a case, if you have Salt in your infrastructure, what you would do is visit this public formula of Vim and simply use the states provided inside this formula to do your installation. So this is the entry point. Init.sls file, if you can see, is the entry point of any formula, right? It makes sure that is where the formula starts from. So if you open init.sls, you can see that this is how a general appearance of a salt SLS file looks. Let me select this to be YAML. And there is some Jinja, as I mentioned, there is a touch of Jinja as well in our salt config file. But let's say you have this init.sls, okay? SLS file is nothing but YAML configuration file mixed with Jinja. And you see, if you simply try to read, salt is not complicated, okay? In terms of that, salt is not using some jargons to achieve some operations. It is using very simple human understandable terminologies. So let's say we're talking about a Vim package called Vim, and we say package.install. This means that we are trying to install a package in the target that we are applying, right? And the second step is that after installation is done, we also want to manage a file on any target machine where the source of the file is on Salt server only, because understand that you can have source on your AWS bucket also if you think that you want to keep the file on AWS buckets. But usually speaking, it's usually on the Salt master itself. So let's say here, this path salt:vim is pointing towards this salt vim file /vimrc. So this vimrc is the file that is basically used for managing the configuration, enforcing a style for our Vim editor, right? So in init.sls, we are doing two things. First of all, we are installing Vim, and then we are placing the file vimrc in the right location so that every time Vim is opened, it is opened in the same way. It looks the same basically across all machines. So once you create this file, there are other files also, which we'll not be talking about because we are trying to keep things simple here. This is an introductory session. But yeah, there can be other SLS files that you can combine and make a formula, as I mentioned, right? So these other files are doing different utilities. And that's simply, after that, when you simply run this, ignore the above lines, and then let's say this is your command line, then you simply run salt, your target machines, and state.apply formulas.vim. Then it will simply enter init.sls and perform installation of Vim, and also make sure that vimrc is up to date according to the one mentioned by us over here, right? So that easy it is to manage the formula. I would not say it's that easy, but it is worth the effort if you have a lot of machines and you are tired of managing things and keeping track of things from different places. That is the real beauty and power of Salt. All right, so we just talked about two important things called config management and automating application setups. Now, the third subject that we are touching upon, and by touching, I mean just talking about it because there is no real time to show something. I would talk about a good example that you might be able to relate if you are using or dealing with Tomcat or Java in your infrastructure, right? That is called reactions. Now, SaltStack has the power to react. Okay, it means that if a certain thing on your minion is changed, let's say you have set up a mechanism where if someone goes and changes my.cnf file of your MySQL manually, then you want salt master to immediately take action and restore the file as it was before, as you had planned to keep it, right? So that capability is there in salt. Or let's say that you know what example we are talking here is that, let's say that your Java memory overflows on any server, because every server has a limited uh, RAM, okay? And we are setting Java memory in our Tomcat configuration. And let's say that you have set it to 8 gigs and it starts overflowing to, let's say, 8.1, 8.2, okay? Now, it would be really tedious if you set up a notification in your monitoring system that you say that, okay, Java is overflowing. Now my monitoring system should alert me. And then when you are alerted, you get up, you SSH into that machine, and then you restart Tomcat, right? This is the ideal flow if you have a single server, okay? But what if I say that a better way would be that if Java memory overflows, you can ask Salt to automatically go ahead and restart Tomcat for you, right? Wouldn't that be a good thing? Wouldn't that make you sleep peacefully at night knowing that, okay, if my Java memory, for whatever reason that you can diagnose later to your monitoring system, if for whatever reason my Java memory overflows, I want my Salt master to immediately restart Tomcat and avoid large downtimes. So this is essentially what we do in our infrastructure, that in case of overflowing of memories, which is unavoidable for some cases, you automatically go ahead and restart Tomcat. This setup has been done in our infrastructure automatically, and this can be achieved using something called beacon and reactors. What does a beacon do? Beacon basically monitors specific files or specific disk usages or specific processes. So in this case, we log everything inside our log files inside Tomcat, right? So we'll know that when Java memory overflows, we are logging it using a specific line saying that Java memory overflowed error. And we basically listen to that error. And as soon as we encounter that error, we immediately create a reaction and ask Salt Master to respond, right? So such instances or similar cases can occur. Let's say that you want to block IP and propagate that change on all the block lists. Let's say you have 10 different honeypot servers across your infrastructures, and when one honeypot server blocks something, you want Salt to propagate that block across all different honeypot servers so that you don't have to do it manually, or you don't have to essentially understand the honeypot's own infrastructure if you have Salt infrastructure there. Let's say then you want to do something like, if one file is changed on one of the servers, you want Salt to trigger change on 10 different servers, and those kind of things are also achievable. And things like actively tracking file logs and taking actions based on matching regular expression. That's what we did when we talked about Java memory overflow error. But you can do many such things using the power of SaltStack's reactor and beacon system. Okay. So that was one important thing. This is kind of like an advanced feature, but if you really think that you want to automate things and you want to automate problems, resolution of common problems that you already foresee in your infrastructure, then Salt can be of help to you. Now comes the question that how are we using Salt? Because every organization has its own way of dealing with things, and we have a special way of dealing with our infrastructure. But mainly, most of the things that I mentioned are the things that we use in our infrastructure, right? We had a choice before whether to use SaltStack or whether to use Ansible. But the reason we decided Salt was because it offers a wide range of features and complex workflows. Okay, So I don't think Ansible is that capable enough. And I think Ansible involves a lot of work, even though it's capable enough to achieve the problems, right? So we use Salt for automating many things. We use for completely almost all our configurations across different applications, including MySQL or Redis or Solr or Kafka or Tomcat or whatever is managed through Salt and only Salt. Okay. Our installation removers are always done using Salt. We use Salt for blocking IPs manually and propagate it across our infrastructure because we have hundreds of VMs and we propagate that using SaltStack. And we use the power of Salt and Salt SSH combined to also perform disaster recovery automation. Okay. And since our services include hybrid cloud services also, because we manage servers and we manage Linux infrastructure on AWS as well. We have our own data centers and AWS coming together for managing disaster recovery, right? So if either or of things crash, then we have a way to spawn it, to spawn complete new instances and VMs as per our expectations using the power of Salt. But yeah, one more thing for your information, Salt is written completely using Python programming language. So if you think that you want to tweak something in Salt or you think you want to contribute in Salt, you can always do that. It's an open source library. So those features are also available. But there are also many things in Salt, which is beyond classic configuration management. Right. Usually speaking, people think that Salt is similar to Ansible. Salt is used for installing things, removing things, automating system admin tasks, and things like that. But no, Salt has a lot more than that. Salt offers things like orchestration, okay, for managing complex workflows. Let's say that we all know what installation does. But let's say you want to do something called something like first you want to make sure that MySQL is installed on a VM. Then you want to make sure that your Node.js application is running on another VM. After only Node.js is up, you want to make sure that it links to Redis on a third VM. Okay, then this complex workflow, and let's say you want to automate this process so that every time you want to create a new instance of this infrastructure bubble, you can simply run a Salt formula and all this is done. So here comes the idea that it's not done all together. It is like a dependent step, right? Like Salt Master will first create a MySQL instance and install MySQL on it. Only after MySQL is installed, it will move on to create another instance and install Node.js on it, deploy your application and make sure that the application passes all the tests and starts the application. Once the application is started, it will make sure that it successfully connects to Redis and only then the formula will successfully end. So these kinds of complex orchestration workflows can be achieved using Salt. The second important feature that Salt offers, now I'm talking about advanced features. Now, this is not something that you want to start with when you start using Salt in your ecosystem, but this is something that you can always consider in future when dependency on Salt becomes heavy and when you people get more familiar with Salt and you think, usually because developers are lazy, they don't want to use 10 different tools if one single tool can serve the purpose, right? Because it involves a learning overhead. So let's say that you are familiar enough and now you want to start using Salt for orchestration, then you can do that. Then there is something called cloud deployment, something similar to what Terraform does, right? We know that Terraform is used for installing things and spawning full-fledged VMs on any desired cloud provider, whether it's VMware, whether it's AWS, whether it's GCP, whether it's Linode. You know that Terraform will do it on all different providers, right? Similar flow is that of Salt Cloud. Salt can achieve creating VMs, and it is really fast. So what it does is that it can deploy a VM on the fly. And after deploying VM, it can also install Salt Minion on it and connect it directly to the master, so that after master is connected, you can again run your procedural formula. Let's say you have some default setup for all the VMs related to security setup, or something related to application limit or kernel properties, that that it's across all the different VMs, okay? Or let's say common user setup. Then this all thing can be achieved without any single involvement of any system administrator. This entire circle of cycle can be achieved using a single command on Salt Cloud, where Salt Cloud is first creating the VM. After the VM is created, the minion is automatically installed. After the minion is automatically installed on the VM, it is connected, that machine gets connected to Salt Master. After Salt Master can send commands to that machine, it will send the command of setting the basic defaults right. And once that is done, you might want to set up an email to your customer that your machine is now ready. So it is beautiful. It is really beautiful to think Salt in terms of how much capable it could be. Usually Salt has the capability to build full-fledged software as a service solutions or infrastructure as service solutions too, right? And that is the beauty of Salt. And one good thing I feel about Salt that Ansible I don't think can provide is that it can provide an API extension, which means that if you want to programmatically control Salt, which means that if you want some code around SaltStack using Node.js or Python or Ruby or whatever, or PHP, and then based on that code, you want to do certain things on Salt Master, right? You can easily achieve that because Salt provides extensions of API, which taps into the Salt's ecosystem. Then you can control things directly using that third part, that API. I'm sorry, not third party, but Salt's own provided API. Then, as I mentioned, there are capabilities of reactions and beacons where you can create triggers based on specific events, right? Yes, so these are basically the capabilities and complexities that Salt can handle. Generally speaking, we use Salt a lot in our infrastructure, and because we believe that automating is the way to go. We do not want to repeat things and on same machines one after the other. So what workflow we usually prefer is that when a new application is to be set up, and let's say we are not very much aware of that application, we install that application manually and sort out its configuration manually in the first VM. And then after we understand the steps of it, we create a dedicated formula for that VM. I'm sorry, for that particular application. Okay. And then let's say when the need comes that we want to install the same application with a little different configuration on some other VM, or for a different customer altogether, then we simply execute the formula. And trust me, at one point, once you start using Salt, you will not want to do it any other way. So I think it's a really beautiful tool. And I think this marks the end of our introductory webinar related to Salt. If any one of you are having any questions related to what Salt does or how can Salt be used, you can ask right now, or you can reach out to us. So is there any questions, anyone? Let's wait for a minute or two if anyone has anything to ask us. Excuse me.
Let's look at whether question will come in through chat. Anybody can post any questions through chat and we'll read them. So it has been a journey using Salt, and it's a learning curve for people who starts using SaltStack. And it's also, as any software, it's a flexible. And sometimes it doesn't give you necessarily the structure how it needs to be done, because it can be done many different ways, but you have to create your structure. We used to target minions by minion name. Then we found limitations of that. We start targeting through pillar, and we named the tags. So, and the whole structure of Salt, how you target and what you install on which servers, it is a journey. We have a question. What would be the best way to start Salt?
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. If you're talking about way in terms of like installation or something, then it's very simple. Then you can simply visit the official Salt page where you're getting the information. But the best setup, we believe, is that to have a Linux virtual machine, either Ubuntu or CentOS, and install an application called Salt Master on it. And then whatever virtual machines you have, let's say you have 10 different virtual machines in your infrastructure, then go on each virtual machine and install something called Salt Minion, which is again an application. Okay. And then you can connect that program of Salt Minion to your Salt Master by opening specific ports. That's how you can start using. But ideally speaking, you can do it on one machine first. Understand you can create a test machine. I guess that's how we started using Salt, that we had a test master and a test machine, a test minion, right? And we first did all our experimentations there. So essentially 2 Linux VMs and you can start using Salt.
I have placed some resources to official SaltStack, and SaltStack is used by a large community. So if you just Google SaltStack basic documentation, there are some recordings on YouTube as well. There are courses for SaltStack as well. So, but it's primarily starting and installing it on some Linux VMs and start experimenting. That's probably would be the best way.
Yes, exactly.
The documentation is very good for SaltStack. I think
because Salt has a sorry to interrupt, but because Salt has this great community, its open source community is one of the largest on GitHub, a lot of support is provided. So you might think that because Salt is a relatively new tool, there is not very much reliability on it, but that's not true. Salt is extremely reliable. There are less and less bugs with the passing days on Salt, even though there are thousands of issues still open on GitHub. Salt, in general speaking, can achieve a lot of tasks without any problems. But then since it's an open source tool, it comes with its own challenges, but it is very less in terms of Salt from what our experience states. So if you're not confident using Salt, then you can always reach out to us and we can tell you more about it.
And after using Salt for many years, there is no way for us going back. It's so convenient. It's of course depends on operation. Smaller operation, you can do it manually, but once your VMs are growing and you have to manage many VMs, we cannot do it without Salt anymore. Sure. Thanks so much for attending, and I hope you find it useful, and good luck on your journey. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.